Welcome everyone. My name is Ed Goetz. I'm the Director of the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the University of Minnesota, and I want to welcome you to the first post-pandemic CURA Housing Forum. The CURA Housing Forum is something that CURA has sponsored for years, if not decades. We haven't had one in almost 4 years, maybe even longer than that. So we are trying to resurrect the Housing Forum, and it is and will continue to be, I think, from this point forward, both an in-person and a virtual event as well. So it is being streamed live, and in the future, and I think we have of those who registered for today, the majority are accessing it virtually, but I'm glad to see all of you here. And so thank you for that. The CURA Housing Forum occurs on a monthly basis during the academic year, so from September through May. So we're going to have one here in April, we're going to have one in May, and then not again until September, but monthly after that. That's the sort of schedule for it. And we are at this point looking for topics that are of interest. If you do have ideas for future CURA Housing Forum topics and speakers, please email me. My email is my first initial and last name at umn.edu. And I would be glad to entertain, and feel free to nominate other people. I won't tell them. Well, I probably will tell them, but that's fine. We need good ideas going forward for topics. So please share. I think at some point we will create a small advisory group that will meet once or twice a year to generate ideas for the Housing Forum going forward. So we thought for the first one that we would choose a topic sort of in-house at CURA. At CURA, Dr. Tony Damiano and I have been conducting some research on investor-owned single-family rentals in Twin Cities. I'll allow Tony to talk more about the full scope of the research, but we thought that would be a good topic for kicking off the return of the housing. So Dr. Damiano received his PhD at the Humphrey School at the University of Minnesota a couple of years ago, and has been working as a research scientist at CURA since then. And so Tony will be making the presentation. We'll go for about 40 minutes or so with the presentation, and then open it up to Q&A. The Q&A has to come from those of you here physically. Although if you're watching the live stream of this and you really have a pressing question, just go ahead and email me, and I'll try to monitor my email and relay potential questions as well. So without any further ado, Tony Damiano.
Hello, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. Thanks, Ed. As Ed pointed out, my name is Dr. Anthony Damiano. Tony is just fine, and I'm a research scientist here at CURA. So today we're here to talk about the single-family rental market in the Twin Cities. In particular, we're here to talk about the growth of institutional investors within this market, and sort of the geography of these different types of owners, as well as the effects these owners may have on eviction rates. So first, I think it makes sense to start with some background on the single family rental market, and in particular since the Great Recession. So basically we've seen pretty substantial growth in the single family rental market as a product since the Great Recession. And this came about in large part due to the foreclosure crisis, the preceding foreclosure crisis. Throughout the country, millions of homes were seized through foreclosure, tax forfeiture, and other means. And after that time, banks and local governments who ended up with these homes on their books tried to get them off as quickly as possible, back on their tax rolls, etc. And so these homes were often sold in batches or bunches for very low prices, for pennies on the dollar, which kind of opened up the way for this sort of first wave of investors to really enter the market. We saw these effects most acutely in the US in the Sun Belt, places like Phoenix, Las Vegas, Atlanta, and also the Rust Belt, Detroit, Cleveland, and Milwaukee were some of the places who saw sort of the worst of it. But even as the Great Recession went away and economic growth returned, we saw investors continue to invest in the market. But we did see sort of a change. In the early parts after the Great Recession, a lot of times these were home flippers who would purchase the home and flip it very quickly. But what we saw into the 2010s and 2020s to present is that we see more investors holding homes and instead. And here we just have some examples. I think Georgia offers some of the most stark data where in the past few years, investors have bought 1 of 4 of all homes on the market. While the Twin Cities has not seen this sort of hyper, extreme types of investor activity in the market, we've still seen substantial growth in the amount of large buyers. Or large owners, in the market. Research from the Federal Reserve Bank shows that very large investors that own 50 or more properties really started to take off after about 2012. And so we have seen more consolidation in the market than there was before the Great Recession. So what does previous research say about sort of the effects of having lots of large owners within the single family rental market? This has been associated with higher rates of eviction, higher rates of rent growth, lower levels of property maintenance, and fewer homeownership opportunities, particularly for first-time buyers and Black buyers. And this research comes out of the Atlanta metro area. So one of the kind of innovations of this research, and I think important to understand, is often when we talk about corporate owners, they all get lumped into one category, and we just say, okay, this is a corporation. But in fact, when we say corporate owner, we're talking about lots of different types of entities. The first and the largest at a national level are real estate investment trusts, and these are publicly traded firms, and their financial records, because they're publicly traded, are public. And so this allows researchers to kind of understand more about their business models and how they work. Kind of the private counterpart to that is private equity firms. And these function in many ways like REITs. But because they're private, they're much harder to investigate and kind of understand both their business strategies and kind of where their portfolios are located. And the last type is kind of a unique product called rent-to-own. And so rent-to-own, the idea is that you rent a home, and during that time, usually when the lease is up, it could be a 3 to 5 year lease, you gain the opportunity to purchase the home. And so this is kind of an in-between, tenure between rental and ownership. These types of firms are not very well regulated and leaves renters open very often for scams and difficult to understand contracts. And so again, 3 different kinds of firms here, but one thing that they do have in common is that they've come under increasing legal scrutiny as they've grown in the market. Perfect example here is HavenBrook Homes in Minnesota, particularly on the north side of Minneapolis. HavenBrook Homes is a private equity firm And the Attorney General's office recently settled a multi-million-dollar lawsuit that claims that HavenBrook failed to maintain their homes, backed up sewers, doors and windows that would not close, mold, wild animals, lead paint, and also violating the COVID-19 eviction moratorium in the state. Another example is Invitation Homes, which is a real estate investment trust. This is one of the biggest REITs that we were able to uncover in our data in Minnesota. They paid out a multi-million-dollar lawsuit in California for illegally hiking rents of their tenants. Another example is Hope Partners of America, which again has a major presence in Minnesota. They are a rent-to-own firm, what often happens in sort of rent-to-own situations is that residents can be evicted and lose any sort of right to buy in the process, and so they've been sued again for these business practices. And so even as I've laid out these three types of entities, of course it gets more complicated, as what tends to happen now is many of these firms grow not by purchasing individual homes, but by buying entire portfolios. So for example, Progress Residential and Front Yard Residential were major REITs. They ended up being bought and then taken private. So what was a public REIT became part of a private equity firm, which is now, again, the firm Pritium / HavenBrook is the firm that was sued by Keith Ellison. So I don't have the ability to sort of like have the little pictures on a string and show all of the connections, but they are there, and it is increasingly complex. Additionally, Home Partners America, the rent-to-own firm that I mentioned, is owned by a private equity firm called BlackRock. So what are we going to do today? Well, today we want to talk about a working paper that is currently under review at a journal that takes a look at these particular questions. Who are the major actors within the Twin Cities single-family rental market? How do the practices of institutional investors differ from non-institutional investors? And additionally, how do these institutional investors differ from each other, right? I mentioned three different kinds previously. Do they all look the same, or do they have exhibit different strategies? And that includes asking questions, how does the geography differ between these different types of owners? What kinds of neighborhoods do they invest in? And then lastly, we ask, what effect does this sort of ownership type have on eviction rates? So the data for this analysis come from 2022 parcel data from Hennepin and Ramsey counties. And one important step, which I'll talk about on the next slide, is that, of course, it's not as easy as just looking at the parcel data, seeing who the big owners are, and putting them on a map. What we do is, after we go through a cleaning process to identify the actual owner of the property, we connect this to data on evictions going back to 2002. And we also supplement the analysis with data from the US Census, which we use the 2015 to 2019 American Community Survey. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, there's significant work that goes in the back end to even identify who the ultimate owner of the property is. So while the parcel data includes information on owner name, owner address, there's a taxpayer name, taxpayer address. There are various ways that different kinds of landlords use to obscure who the ultimate owner is. And this often happens through the creation of shell companies and LLCs. So for example, the REIT Home Partners of America, if you look at the parcel data, they maybe have 20 different LLCs that might say HPA borrower dash 2019 dash a number. If you look at Invitation Homes, they use LLCs that usually start with IH2 dash numbers, etc. So a lot of work has to go into just trying to figure out, okay, does this LLC, is it ultimately part of a larger group of owners, we connect them to a single entity? So that's been probably about 80% of the work to this point, is just working through that. And so in order to try to get to the bottom of this, we use a three-step process. First, we work to standardize the addresses. In many cases, the owner or taxpayer address are in different formats. We use software called OpenRefine, which allows us to kind of find like names and like addresses and go through and identify, okay, is this part of a larger cluster? So for example, you might see an owner be listed as J. Miller in one entry, J. A. Miller in another, and John A. Miller. And so we can then look to see, okay, are these the same person or not? And even after that, there's still a lot of complexity that still remains. And so we, myself and with the help of research assistants, have gone through and done our best to hand clean these. And through that process of hand cleaning, we also try to identify, is this entity a private equity firm? Is it a rent-to-own firm? Is it a REIT? So that all has to happen before we can do any type of data analysis. So what do we find? After we finish this clustering, what does the rental market look like? What kinds of owners, what kind of owners do we see? Well, the first thing to note, if you start at the top, is that what we find is the vast majority of rentals are owned by what we're calling micro owners, meaning they own only one property. Close to 3/4 of all single-family rentals that we estimate exist in Hennepin and Ramsey County are owned by very small, these micro owners. Next, as we move up sort of our size category, we move to small landlords who own 2 to 5 properties. They make up about 13% of the area total. Medium landlords own, we estimate, around 5.5% of single-family rentals. And lastly, we have large, so greater than 20, own 3.5%. And I should point out here that these first set of categories, these are, as far as we can tell, not corporate entities. These are either mainly individuals or smaller kind of local actors. We then break out these sort of institutional investors that I mentioned before. I should point out that all of these institutional investors we would classify as large, meaning that they have more than 20. But we wanted to break that out separately so that we're able to understand kind of both kinds of owners. Private equity, we estimate, own about 1.5% of the single family rentals. REITs own 1.8%, and that rent-to-own own a little under 1%. I want to make brief mention of another type of housing that we're not going to go into much of the analysis, but these are kind of a new product. They're subdivisions that are built as single family rentals. And so those initially had a very small N in our sample, and so we don't spend a lot of time on them in there. So our next question, once we have kind of done all of this background research to try to figure out who these owners are, how many properties they own, we wanted to figure out again what kind of places, where do these different places operate? And one, of course, very interesting pattern is that, again, these different types of owners are not equally distributed at all in our study. While you can see here that micro owners, owners that own only one property, are generally fairly well distributed throughout the metro area, we see sort of more extreme patterns as we move up the size chain. So I can explain briefly the measurement we're using. It's called a location quotient, meaning basically how much more or less concentrated are these entities compared to the region as a whole. So location quotient greater than 1 means that there are more homes of that type than would be expected otherwise. A location quotient less than 1 means they're less concentrated than we would expect otherwise. And so green means higher concentrations, greater than 1. The tan is less than 1. So even moving up, as we move from the micro to the small, we see significantly more concentration of small owners within central cities. in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Moving up to medium, the 5 to 20 category, we see again concentrations in the central cities, but also in inner ring suburbs, particularly around Robbinsdale, Crystal, Brooklyn Center. And lastly, when we look at the large non-institutional investor landlords, they're highly concentrated on the north side of Minneapolis, the eastern parts of St. Paul, and again, those same inner ring suburbs in Hennepin County. Here we have a similar spatial distribution map, but for our institutional investor owners. And here again, we see some very kind of stark patterns. And in particular, what stands out is where the hyper concentration of private equity firms on the north side of Minneapolis. We calculated that there are neighborhoods where over 16% of all rental homes are owned by private equity firms. So that's a very significant concentration, well above, again, their concentration within other parts of the metro area. We also see high concentrations of private equity on the east side of St. Paul. REITs show a very different pattern. REITs, we see concentrated, we see a lot fewer REIT-owned homes in the central cities, except for the far east side of St. Paul is sort of an exception there. But we really see concentrations of them in sort of the inner and middle ring suburban communities. And lastly, where we see REITs, or excuse me, where we see rent-to-own firms is kind of even farther out. We see REITs, the highest REIT concentrate, or excuse me, even I get confused by all these complex entities. Excuse me, rent-to-own firms are most heavily concentrated in sort of second ring suburban communities and exurban communities. What do we know about kind of the value of these homes? What kind of homes do these different owners own? And so we took a look at the estimated market value, the average estimated market value of homes broken out by owner type. The first trend that we see is as portfolio size increases for non-institutional owners, the average value tends to decline, right? That micro has the highest average value and that declines as we move down to the 20 plus. On average, private equity owns sort of the lowest value homes at about $190,000. REITs were higher, closer, a little, at least $70,000 higher at about $260,000. And rent to own had sort of the highest average value at $350,000. And this was interesting to note that the rent to own homes were higher than the average value for the region as a whole. And this includes, the region as a whole includes all single family homes, both renter and owner occupied.
What data point did you use to determine home value?
Estimated market value from the parcel data.
Thank you.
In addition to understanding the value of the homes, we wanted to understand what kinds of neighborhoods are these homes located. We did a geographic analysis previously, but we also wanted to look at sort of the socioeconomic characteristics of the neighborhood type as well. And these patterns largely hold across different socioeconomic variables that you would like to use. So first, we'll take a look at the percentage, the average percent white in each neighborhood by owner type. We see that micro-owner homes are owned in neighborhoods that are slightly whiter than the study area as a whole. Again, average percent white tends to decline as portfolio size increases. Typical large non-investor landlord-owned homes were in majority BIPOC neighborhoods. Private equity-owned homes were in neighborhoods that were around 40% white. REIT homes tended to be around the region, the two county region as a whole, and rent to own were in neighborhoods that were slightly wider than the region as a whole. We see the same pattern again, looking at poverty rate, right? We see that for micro owners, those homes are located in the lowest poverty neighborhoods on average. For non-investor owners, and then that rate increases as portfolio size increases, with the average poverty rate in large non-investor owners around 20%. Private equity mirrors this, again, very high average poverty rates at around 20%, with those declining significantly for REIT and rent-to-own homes. Lastly, we wanted to understand how owner type might relate to eviction rates. Do the business practices of these different kinds of entities, do they result in different patterns of eviction? So looking at kind of average annualized eviction filing rates, we again see a similar trend where micro owners have the lowest, and then that increases as portfolio size increases, and with private equity REITs tending to be higher on average. The rate, for example, for large non-institutional owners is 7 times as high as micro owners. The highest rate that we see is for private equity, which is about 7% of homes on an annual basis experienced an eviction filing. And this disparity is even greater. This is 15 times as high as for micro owners. And then for REITs and rent to own, that was between 6 and 7 times as high as for micro owners. We see the same pattern for if we change our data to look at, instead of eviction filings, which is just a filing in court, to an eviction judgment. So an eviction judgment is when a tenant is actually removed from the home. Again, this pattern holds with private equity leading the way with the highest rate of eviction judgments compared to other ownership types. So these data are very suggestive of the idea that ownership type plays a role in eviction, in the differences that we see with eviction rates. However, as our sort of previous slides have shown, there's a lot of correlation between ownership type and neighborhood type, and so could be a lot of confounding variables related to tenant income, race, and neighborhood characteristics. So for our final analysis, we ran a multivariate model to try to control for as many things as we could related to housing unit characteristics, neighborhood level characteristics, ownership length, things like that. So with the housing unit variables, we were able to include market value, housing age, how long the owner had owned the home. Neighborhood level characteristics that we included were racial characteristics, median rent, median home value, or excuse me, median household income. And lastly, we included zip code fixed effects, which are a way to control for any unobserved spatial variation. One limitation of our results is that we do lack data on tenant characteristics. So even after controlling for all of these things, we still find real statistically significant evidence that ownership type is related to eviction rates. The first finding that we have using our controls is that even controlling for all these factors, we saw higher than average eviction rates in majority BIPOC neighborhoods. It was small, but again, statistically significant, about 1.5% more likely. All owner types, again, across these categories, showed higher rates of eviction on average compared to micro owners, even after controlling, holding all else equal. The 3 institutional owners, you can see at the top, rent-to-own, REIT, and private equity. Their rates were higher than all types of non-institutional investor owners. REIT ownership showed the highest marginal effect. A REIT ownership was associated with a 22 percentage point higher likelihood of an eviction filing compared to micro. Rent to own had the next highest at 15 percentage points. And sort of interestingly, private equity, which had the highest raw rate, was closer to rent to own at about 16%. And we think the reason why sort of private equity gets bumped down a little bit is, again, due to that correlation. Private equity, again, is hyper-focused on lower income neighborhoods. And so we believe that they're buying in places that are already prone to higher eviction rates. And so that's why we think the marginal effect kind of isn't as large as sort of the raw rate suggests. And a trend that you'll be familiar with by now, based on every other slide that I've showed, this holds again for eviction judgments, right? The marginal impact of ownership type for non-institutional investors increases as portfolio size increases. And then for each of the institutional investor types, we see a increased effect. And again, with REIT the largest effect, and then private equity and rent to own also being elevated. So to sum everything up, what we found in terms of the locational strategies of these firms is that while these institutional investors make up a small percentage of units overall, only 4.2% of units overall, that there's sort of an extreme spatial disequilibrium between ownership type, right? That we see private equity being hyper-concentrated in low-income communities of color. We see REITs being concentrated in sort of inner and middle ring suburbs, and rent-to-own being sort of more concentrated in second ring and exurban communities. Another interesting finding related to location is that there were a lot of similarities in spatial strategies between larger local firms and private equity firms. But even though both of those types of owners were highly concentrated in low-income communities of color, we see much higher marginal effects of private equity ownership compared to non-institutional investor owners. So again, our summary findings related to the eviction work. For non-institutional investor owners, eviction rates rise as portfolio size increases. Large landlord-owned homes were 9 percentage points more likely to receive an eviction filing and 5 percentage points more likely to receive an eviction judgment. All three types of institutional investor landlord were associated with higher eviction rates. These were higher than all non-institutional landlords. And that the REIT ownership showed sort of the largest marginal impact and increased the probability of receiving an eviction filing by 22 percentage points and eviction judgment by 11 percentage points. So again, we believe that these are not only statistically significant results, but also potentially practically significant. And these are fairly large numbers. Rates for private equity and rent to own were also elevated compared to micro owners. They were around 16 percentage points more likely to receive an eviction notice than so this is our first paper, first analysis of this, and we have more sort of quite a bit more that we're looking to build on this research in the pipeline. Right now, we're currently running a survey on tenants living in single-family homes in Hennepin and Ramsey County. We have sent out postcards to 9,000, pushing on 10,000 tenants throughout Hennepin and Ramsey County, seeking their input on their living conditions, how they found out about their home, are they experiencing harassment, the kind of fees they pay, the rent, things like that. And then we'll use that and we'll connect the results of the survey back to our database on ownership to try to see what sort of patterns emerge and do tenant experiences tend to match up with kind of our findings related to evictions. We do have some preliminary results from a pilot survey we did of single-family rental tenants living in North Minneapolis. And while the sample size wasn't large enough to make definitive conclusions, the results are consistent with what we found. that tenants living in homes owned by larger landlords experience higher rates of harassment, sometimes higher rents, and generally had a worse experience in their homes than tenants living in properties owned by smaller homes. We're also working to trace back the ownership backwards using historical tax parcel data to kind of track the connection between the foreclosure crisis and the current corporate ownership of homes, so we can sort of trace that ownership pattern back over time. And we're also looking to connect our ownership database to Minneapolis has a very nice public database on code violations. And so we can then also track housing conditions by ownership. So that's all we have. I want to thank you all, both folks who made it out here in person within, the wacky weather, the snow and things like that, and also for everyone who's joining us online. So thank you all very much. And now we will open it up to questions to Ed and myself. Yes.
Yeah, with the smaller owners, were you able to separate out short-term rental owners?
That's a good question. So an ongoing issue that we're dealing with and a lot of other teams are dealing with is kind of the denominator of how we identify a rental. So we used whether it was non-homesteaded or not. And so it may or may not have included those in our sample. But I think in general, when we've compared the number of rentals we've had to census data, that it's been within a fairly close range.
And I think as Tony mentioned, we have this parcel data annually back to reliably 2005. And so we're coding all the way back. And so we'll be able to see units that switch from homestead to non-homestead and back again. And that's a longitudinal part of the analysis that's in the future too.
Your last but one slide had talked about housing conditions, but there's a noticeable lack of any information and any description about housing stock. In other words, the age and the condition of the actual physical buildings that populate the areas that you talk about. There's a lot on socioeconomic status, ownership. How does that tie into housing stock? Because presumably institutional investors are interested in the stock, not as well as the people that are involved in the stock. I mean, that's a fundamental real estate market. Which gets me onto a point here. I'm curious to know, in your statistics, what was the aerial unit? Because I've long argued that many of our models of city development, city processes, are not using the appropriate spatial unit, it seems to me. That's just my personal opinion.
Sure. So the models that we used, the unit of analysis is the property level. And so unit of analysis is the property level with socio and economic characteristics from the census tract tied to the property. So that allowed us to include both characteristics of the individual property. So we included building age and building value to sort of get at this idea of quality, the quality of the homes. And then as well as neighborhood characteristics like racial characteristics, median rent and median house.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I am a student in public health and I'm also an organizer with United Renters for Justice. So I'm very curious about this presentation from a couple different angles. I have two questions. One is on the sort of public health side. I know that there's some emerging research now on the health impacts. Well, we have a lot of research on health impacts of eviction, but specifically around institutional ownership and the impact of private equity on sort of the health of renters and tenants in these neighborhoods. So I'm curious if you've come across that in your work, if you're seeing that show up in the surveys or anything that you can share on that subject. And then the second question, I'm just curious about how you're conducting the surveys, if you're working with any like community groups or organizations in North Minneapolis, like just how you're identifying tenants to participate in the surveys.
It has occurred to me that we should probably try to repeat the summary of the question for people who are not here. So I want to repeat the first part of it.
So, what have we seen in our research to this point that sort of connects to public health? And sort of the connection with housing conditions and health we've seen in this.
And so the survey did ask questions about safety and health related to the units that folks were in. We asked questions about repairs that were needed and done or not done. And so as Tony alluded to in his presentation, reporting adverse health interactions with where you live and adverse safety interactions tended to increase as the size of the portfolio of the ownership increased as well. So that was part of the consistent results that we.
And then the second question was related to how we're conducting the full survey and kind of what community partners we are working with.
So we are conducting the survey by mail. We know the addresses of these properties, but we don't know the names of the tenants. And that leaves us with sending postal recruitment letters that are basically dear occupant or dear resident. And that is not a good way to get a strong response rate. But it's the only way that we have to get at scale. So on the pilot study of the north side, our response rate was about 18%, which was actually better than I had hoped for. We have duplicated this with a much larger sample now in countywide for both Hennepin and Ramsey. And we're still in the middle of that, but it looks like response rates are actually lower in that. We work with a couple of neighborhood and tenant organizations to follow up with contacts at the addresses of the sample in the north on the north side,
Including IX.
including IX, and we are working with 4 different organizations in this second round of surveys as well, to try to do outreach to increase response rates.
Yeah, I think, I don't know if it was y'all specifically, but I think CURA had a really interesting paper on informal evictions. So I'm curious if that's a concern at all when you're using evictions as an outcome if you're missing. My assumption, like my hypothesis would be that smaller landlords are probably more likely to go the informal route compared to these like formalized entities, but maybe that's not the case. But just curious if you have thoughts on that. How
Right. So the question was that CURA has done other research on rates of formal eviction proceedings and what might be called informal eviction proceedings, actions by landlords that are aimed at pushing people out of units short of the eviction filing. And so we get to that sort of in an indirect way through the survey by asking about incidences of harassment, retaliation, and other things that might be seen as attempts to discourage further habitation. In terms of using the same data on informal evictions versus formal, that was that we got that through an agreement with HomeLink,
Homeline,
I always get that.
Housing Link, Homeline.
Right. And data confidentiality meant that we could only get that at the census tract level. We might go back to them and try to get it at the parcel level, and then we could connect that to ownership characteristics. And that's something we've thought about.
Maybe at a census level, I was just flipping through my phone to try and remember, but I feel like you guys found that this was like more common in some of the same neighborhoods where there was a lot of formal or a lot of institutional owners. So it feels like that's like part of the story there, but
Yeah, it's possible. Yes.
I'm really curious how this work can be translated into policy. I know that like here in Minneapolis, we've got like a rental license tiering system. So if there are more like, say like health violations that are landlords incurring, their rental license fee goes up. You mentioned Georgia as a place where this is like kind of running rampant. Like if we know that institutional investors are likelier to be irresponsible landlords, has like Georgia piloted any sort of policies that I'm having trouble like imagining a law that wouldn't be like invalidated via lawsuit as like prejudicial or are there any sorts of policies?
So the question is, what potential connections are there into public policy responses?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's some of the first steps I've seen being taken both at the national level and at the state level is trying to get some transparency first around ownership, because it's not clear, if, wherever you are, a city official, you see something LLC, right? You have no way of knowing that this is part of a larger conglomerate without doing extra research, right? Like there's no way to know a priori who this entity is. So there's been work, there's been a couple bills moving through the state house here. I'm not quite sure on their status. That would try to, I think, both bring more transparency around who owns the properties and also sort of limiting portfolio size. Because we haven't seen it in practice, I have no idea how well those will work, right? Because if you can just sort of play shell games with your property, how do you actually pin down these entities? So I think that there's definitely been conversations around it, but I haven't seen anything that's really been implemented or kind of what that looks like. And I think in places like Georgia, one of the reasons that Georgia is such a hotbed is they have some of the worst renter protections in the country, to the point that there isn't even a habitability standard. So there's no law that says that the rental unit has to be habitable. So if you want to know where the politics of where it is in Georgia, that's kind of, I think, definitely a factor on why the Sun Belt has been such a hotbed.
So in addition to the data transparency as a policy implication, you talked about rental licensing as a way of responding to this, at least increasing information that's available. Some places have investigated limits on investor ownership. Some places have considered targeted repurchasing by public or nonprofit and publicly subsidized nonprofits as ways of attempting to respond to these kinds of things. There and then there.
So I got a few questions. One is the only metric you have for property management issues or maintenance issues is the code violations, or is there some self-reporting that is being tracked by the tenant and or complaints of some sort? Number two would be how does contract for deed play a role in this situation, or have you tracked any information in regards to that? And then also you were talking about that you would be able to go back to as far as 2005, I want to say, to find the ownership tract. Who was in line of the ownership? Are you tracking that to also make sure to identify the wealth extraction from those communities and to identify the exploitation of it when the pricing came back? In addition to understanding the proximity of the owner to said property, so see if they are an out-of-state owner and or suburban owner of a metro city property.
So what was the first question?
First one was about the data on conditions. Is it just the?
So for different strands of research, we're using different data sets. So for kind of once we get our survey, we'll be able to use tenant the answers to their questions, tenant identified issues. We would also like to use city code violations as well. We're sort of more limited on the geography of that because most cities don't make it public, so we won't be able to do maybe the whole 2 counties, but we can at least look at it for places like Minneapolis that make it public. So I think we would like to, again, sort of combine as many data sources as we can to try to get a sense of to what extent are they in agreement and what we need to say about that. Oh, and then questions about contract for deed. My understanding, again, feel free to correct me, is that contract for deed is another way of saying rent to own, as far as I've heard. And so I think they often get used interchangeably. I think I hear contract for deed around here. Did you hear that more?
Sure, they may be interchangeably used, but they actually have 2 different positions. One, as the contract for deed, they circumvent a lot of the property maintenance and other reasons. I won't go into the litany of that, but and so I think that there does need to be some separate approach to those, because a rent to own is just on a glorified lease where you actually have equitable you have a sellable position with contract for deed. So I think that does bear some separation.
And your last 2 questions were also fascinating. The possibility does exist to look at wealth extraction based on the timing of conversion from ownership to rental, and then maybe conversion back again. And that's certainly a research topic that we would be interested in following up. And you also mentioned proximity of owners to the property. And we do indeed plan to pursue that question as well, because we have the address of the taxpayer or address of the owner. And we were thinking of an analysis that would identify owners that live in the neighborhood or in the city or in the region or outside altogether, and see what difference that makes on any number of different outcomes.
If I can put you on one more element of that, if you could see if there's a higher correlation with those who are considered long distance absentee owners and let's say police calls to the property and or criminal activity that is associated with that address, and if they're closer in proximity, should that have a correlation of?
And to your wealth extraction point, the team at Georgia Tech has looked at this. I haven't read the paper yet, but they do have a paper. It's Brian On and his team. And they found evidence of, again, I think exactly what you're saying is in the Atlanta area of extreme wealth extraction by these corporate owners through the process. But it would be, I think, very useful to look at that in our context here as well.
Yes.
How do the eviction rates compare generally and maybe across property types to multifamily property owners?
I don't know. The question was, what do eviction rates in single family rentals, how do they compare to eviction rates in more multifamily buildings?
I don't know, that's a good question.
I would invite those who are still with us online. If you do have a question, you could email me at egoetz@umn.edu.
I was curious if you all were able to get your eyes or your hands on any leases. And I was curious if they were different depending on sort of who owns it, if you noticed any differences, if you had seen those. Specifically for the institutional owners, and did they have policies on evictions? Any of these institutions? Is any of that public anywhere? Is this something you've looked into? And do they have, if these are things that you've looked into, do these organizations or these institutions, do they have specifically policies about their eviction process and renting to people who have been formally evicted? And maybe the process on tenant selection?
So the question was, have we looked at leases and are there characteristics of leases that differ by owner type? And the answer to that, unfortunately, is no, we haven't looked at leases. We did ask the survey respondents about whether they have a copy of their lease, and a distressingly large percentage seems either not to have a lease or not to be in possession of the lease. And I think that too varied by size. Although it's a small number. So, but that's all we have. Jack?
And two quick questions. One is, do you have a sense in which these big owners of single family homes are players in the larger rental market? I mean, in other words, is owning single family homes a specialty, or are they big rental owners that happen to own single family homes too?
As far as I've seen, these are all specialties that they're specific products that didn't exist before the recession, particularly these real estate investment trusts that specialize in these. And so I have not seen, to my knowledge, the big players, the Invitation Homes, the BlackRocks of the world. I have not seen them really have a foray outside of the single family market.
And the second question is, it seems to me one of the major significances of single family homes is they tend to be larger, 3, 4, 5 bedroom units, and which are almost unique in the rental housing market. So do you have a sense of the extent to which in the whole metro area rental housing market, single family owners, the percentage of 3+ bedroom home units that they control?
I don't know off the top of my head, but that's something we might be able to pursue. I know our initial pilot survey did show a higher share of families, right? That compared to the rental population as a whole, families living in single family rental homes were more likely to have kids and to be larger. So we were able to find, we're able to see that.
Well, I guess to your point, like something we run into a lot around the U of M is that these are multifamily housing buildings, but that the out of state ownership just has leases that violate Minnesota statute because they just copy and paste from other state and then use adherence. You know, they have illegal clause after illegal clause that violate our state law. And unless you're a tenant and you know that and you bring it to, you know, student legal services or home line, there really is no way to get that corrected and sign the lease. So it would be interesting to get, you know, leases on some of these like private equity or like REITs. So I was just sort of thinking more back to like the idea of policy solutions. I mean, short of banning, like how do we, you know, if we're trying to get toward limiting corporate purchase of single family homes to retail rental properties, like what would be useful even for you all from a research perspective of like, how do we get these owners to report like their actual ownership structure? And so then you can start doing like bump them up the rental tier license automatically. If this is a private equity owned house, you're automatically a high inspection tier. Like, is there have others like cities or municipalities around the country like had success in requiring reporting on how these owners are structured?
I don't think that nut has been cracked very well anywhere. I think in some places, researchers are driven to state level Secretary of State tax filing data. But that's extremely difficult to do. And so people are thinking about it, but I don't know what that solution is yet to make ultimate ownership much more transparent, and then to reveal the kinds of webs of ownership that we know exist but really can't well describe. Yes.
I'm thinking about the real estate investment trust and the word trust. And maybe this is something that's obvious, but who are these investors? Where are they coming from? And the thought that comes to my mind the most is this like a tax shelter for investors?
I think a lot of the real estate investment trusts, I mean, they're publicly traded, so you can buy shares in it. I know within the industry, a lot of pension funds get involved because they're very safe investments. I mean, that's part of the issue, right? You have people literally writing you checks every month, right? And not only are you able to gain income on a monthly basis, you're also able to gain on sale. And so you have these two parallel income streams that make them very lucrative, which is why they've grown, and make them very safe investments. So I don't know to what extent they're used as tax shelters or kind of what the investor breakdown looks like, but I think those are very interesting questions.
If I can I add to that? I feel like I was listening to the radio a while ago about multifamily, the brand new multifamily units that are being constructed everywhere. I feel like that's where I was hearing that. Like, investors were by and large people who had large amounts of money that they needed to invest.
I wonder if you could speak to any trends that you've seen or are aware of in terms of length of ownership, like that I guess what I'm asking is, I know we've seen in Minneapolis with Progress specifically, is this strategy of buying up homes, renting them out at high rent, low maintenance, selling them off. That's part of the wealth extraction story, obviously. So if you could speak to what the research or what research there is on like length of ownership and how that's trending at a national or at a local level.
One thing I do know is that the rising interest rates have slowed down new purchases. And so even in a lot of the hot spots, you're not seeing investor activity stop. But I think the high interest rates are definitely are definitely slowing it down a little bit. I guess to this point, I don't know how much divestment, how much sales are taking place. Part of the limitations again of our current analysis is it's just point in time, and so I don't know. I mean, other than sort of HavenBrook having to, being forced to sell via the lawsuit, I don't know to what extent these homes are being sold, as opposed to, or how long they plan to hold them.
And, there are research teams around the country looking at this like we are, but everyone looks at it in a slightly different way. There's at least one team that has created a topology based basically on the strategy of length of ownership, right? They've got flippers, they've got holders, they've got fixers. And they're trying to sort of differentiate the market by the type of approach taken on this very question, which is really another way of saying, how are you going to make your money? And there are different ways of doing it. So.
Is there any difference in the reason for the eviction filings across ownership type? So my understanding is the data do say, is there like for non-payment of rent or for other causes?
It's a good question. I don't know specifically for our sample, but other research has connected REIT ownership with serial eviction, meaning the use of eviction filings not as a way to remove the tenant from the home, but as a way to extract rent. So basically, if you're a big company, the cost of the lawyer is fairly marginal. And so basically, what some of these firms will do is if you hit a certain delinquency period, they automatically will send you an eviction notice. And again, the goal there is not necessarily to remove you, but to drag you into court to work out a repayment plan so they can get paid more quickly. So we do know that there are different tactics used, I think, between corporate entities, and something that's probably going to be less likely for a owner that owns 3 properties is going to want to spend days in court trying to extract that rent.
Oh, we have a question coming in on email. It says, will the researchers be able to look at wealth extraction as an individual harm? I'm thinking along the lines of comparing this study to the eminent domain impact, for example, in Rodville. I think my initial reaction to that is we're picking up these units after they have been converted to rentals. We don't know. I mean, we can. We can, yes. So the answer is yes.
We have the property ID, and so then we can look back through the whole data set. See what previous values were.
Yeah.
So we should be able to do that at the property level.
But not relate them to any individual characteristics of the previous owners.
Probably not characteristics of the previous.
I think I was surprised to see, I guess in my mind, I imagine that there would be way more institutional ownership of single family rentals in Minneapolis. I was just wondering if you have an idea how many properties you were unable to trace to some of these companies. It seems like if their game is to like kind of obscure their ownership, the fact that they have like formulas for how to title their LLCs, like that's crazy. Like, do you think that there are a lot of properties that software you used were just unable to?
So ironically, I think where we're most likely to miss are not the big players, but it's the medium local players, because the big players are systematic enough and they name them in a systematic way, right? And so if I see IH and a dash, right, we can write code that looks for any LLC that has IH dash something. Home Partners of America all start with HPA. So what's the entities that are actually harder to find are usually local actors that own a lot of homes, but what they'll do is they'll create a separate LLC for each property they own. And so you'll see 123 Oak Street LLC, 124 Oak Street LLC. And so how do you connect that those are the same entity? Well, we can look at the tax address and see if the taxes are the same address, but even then, sometimes these local actors will use different addresses. And so then you have to go to the Secretary of State database and say, is there some connection between these addresses and a human being? That they're listed as the, the owner of multiple LLCs. So, and so our algorithmic work picks up as much of that as possible. We do rounds of hand cleaning to get as many as we can. Would never claim that our system is perfect at all, but I think our biggest weakness is in sort of that medium range where the connections are even more tenuous without additional. Where Invitation Homes, everything gets sent to the same PO box. So ironically, those are the easiest ones to spot.
So we came here thinking that we had a wide-ranging research agenda, and we've now heard 17 more research questions. We need to add to that. So I'd like to thank you all for that, seriously. We will be able to incorporate many of those in the work that we do. So thank you again, and I will once again extend my invitation to you all to send me ideas for future CURA Housing Forums. I guess what I neglected to say the first time around is that CURA Housing Forums are not just reporting on university research, right? We also, most of the CURA Housing Forums over the years have been on issues in the community. If you want to know more about a policy, you want to know how it's working in Brooklyn Park or wherever it is, right? These are the things that we can pull together for practitioners as well. So email me with ideas that you have, and thank you for your attendance today, and we look for the announcement for May's CURA Housing.
Thank you.